because I'm from Russia, but I live in a boring city of Vienna. And because I live in the city of Vienna and I do React development, I also decided to help with organizing a local meetup group called React Vienna. And we do local meetups, so if you're in Vienna and you want to speak at our meetup or just attend it, please let me know, and we will organize an event, or I will just let you know when the next one is happening. And also, recently we had this conference about this new language called Reason, and we had a conference, the first world conference about Reason in Vienna, which I'm super proud of. And also in Vienna, where is this building? Who of us have been to Vienna before? Wow, impressive. Who knows what this building is? Okay, it says underneath, so sorry. Anyways, that's Kunsthistorisches Museum Wien, which is, like, it's long. Yeah, so that's the place where we use painting as wallpapers, like literally. So, and one of the painting is from one of my favorite artists, by Peter Bruegel. It's called The Tower of Babel. And the story of, who knows what the story of this picture kind of is? Okay, a couple of hands. So let me read it. So according to the story, a united humanity speaking a single language agreed to build a city and tower tall enough to reach heaven. God, observing where city and tower confound their speech so that they can no longer understand each other, and scatters them around the world. And to be precise, there are 7,097 different languages in the world as of now, and some of them are pretty much okay-ish, some of them are a little bit weird, some of them a little bit more weird, like German, for example. That stands a little bit out. But if we look at how people count, you kind of get the idea where it goes. So I don't want to live in Sweden, or what, is it Sweden? Is it in Sweden? So I kind of tried to learn French once, and that thing was pretty much the most intimidating experience, like counts and numbers, so I quit. So what is language? Language is a system that consists of the development, acquisition, maintenance, and use of a complex system of communication, according to Wikipedia, of course. So I started thinking about this idea, and I searched for different languages. So first I found this interesting Dogi language. And I was looking at these images, and I was like, yeah, okay, kind of a language. Then I found a cat language, which was much more complex, you know? Like twice as complex, probably. And then I was thinking more about this, and I kind of realized that human language is different, right? So it's not as simple as animals' language, and that's because the language they use is, and I will quote, language provides us with a system that is a limited, finite system of units that combine hierarchically and recursively into larger units. And I really like this definition of it. But before we go deeper into this, there is also this notion of universal languages I want to talk about a little bit. Whereas this idea of kind of, it was an old idea also, how can we use all have universal languages like animals and humans. I mean, that's not possible, obviously. But there is one good example, in my opinion, and I love music. I listen to lots of music. So, and I think music shit is something that is pretty much universal. So if you look at this notation, pretty much everyone who knows that language, independently of where he lives or what language he or she speaks, can read this and can interpret this on any instrument, pretty much. And kind of the same thing happens to design. So if you think about design, there are of course some constraints and some cultural things that are different, but in general, the design languages, the concepts of the fundamentals of design language are pretty much the same. And I think that's three main things that make the design language. It's typography, color, and spacing. So these three things kind of form the whole design language. Or much more to it, but I think that is the most important things. So why is it important, you might ask? Because I think all these three things together, they kind of create the user experience if we talk about digital products or how they perceive things. So let's take a couple of examples. Let's say typography. If you can see, like, that's exactly the same text, but set in a different rules. So one time there's no white space in between, and the second time we added some white space. And it's obviously that the second one is much more readable and much more pleasant to look at. The same goes with color. With low contrast or no contrast, it's really hard to communicate the difference between objects, even if it's kind of should be obvious, right? And if we add a contrast, it's obviously you can see that this is kind of a button because it stands out and it takes your attention. And spacing also adds structure and flow and written. So I created this kind of list of things what design language does. Don't refer to me because I have no idea about this. But I found a couple of examples that kind of explain it. And the first one, it's establish the brand. So I found this interesting example when I was using one of the services of how design language can establish a brand. And who of you think which one is Dropbox here? The left one, but is it really easy to tell this? So why not right one? I mean, it's really, in my opinion, it's really hard to tell. Although there's a completely different services, they share the same design language, kind of, and that makes them look similar. And the consistency, it's the thing that can make same meaningful thing look completely different. And this is an example from a US government website. So they have like plenty of websites. And then they were doing a UI review for and collecting, when they're preparing the redesign, they went through all the pages and they screenshotted all the different instances of a button. So each of these behaves exactly the same, but they look completely different. So they found that many of them. And as humans, we are really good at recognizing patterns. And this is why it's important. Because when people start using your product, they kind of, they find these patterns and then they follow them. So oftentimes they don't read text even on buttons and labels. And you can use this for bad things as well. So this is a great example of so-called dark patterns or shady patterns, where the Amazon just switches the color for the primary button during one single process, basically tricking you to not cancel the subscription if your first intent was to cancel a subscription. Don't do this. People will hate you for that. It's also bad for karma. And accessibility is one of the things that also, it's not just, so oftentimes people think accessibility it's about disabled people. It is not. Accessibility is a more general term, and it applies exactly the same. It's probably not exactly the same, so some people can suffer more from less accessible things as others. But if you can see, that is an example of pretty much inaccessible text for everyone who is in that room as well. So, and I can see pretty much well. I still can't read the text on the right. So the question is how do we enforce these design practices and good practices in our products? And to do that, we have design systems. And there are lots of talks about design systems. And one of the definitions I found is design system defines a set of design-related rules as a system of instructions that can be reused across single or multiple products. And I think Lego is a great example. That is a picture of 3 toys made of one set of blocks. So you buy one set of blocks or bricks or pieces, because we're also wheels. And you can create 3 different things out of them by combining them in a little bit different way, which is a great example. There's also graphical design examples like this one, comparing German government versus Austrian government logotypes. So in one example, you see how the design system was applied to the process, and the second example shows the lack of a design system. And you can see it also in the product itself. So all the German websites for federal government, they follow these guidelines, or at least they try to, and they all look the same. Where in Austria, people are more creative, I guess. So eventually, I'll just switch here. So yeah, the problem with this is that because all of these websites kind of belong together, because we have a single government in Austria as well. So when a person comes to a first website, he kind of learns how to use it, where the search is, where the navigation is located, and then the same person goes to the last website, and it's the other way around. It's kind of a mental overhead for a person, so it's not good. Which brings me to the next kind of topic, which is a design system for digital products, where we have a user interface as a main thing. So it's not always just websites. So I mainly work on more complex web applications. They still use web as a platform, but most of the time, what I work with is kind of complex UIs, long lists and stuff. So here is an example of a simple list of items, and the list consists of list items, and each of these list items also consists of components. And it's like components are everywhere. And components, to me, it's like a building blocks of user interfaces. So the interesting property about components, in my opinion, is that all of them can have different variants. But by combining them in different ways, we can use the same set of components and form different user interfaces. And that is cool. And it's not a new idea. So iOS component library has been around for many years. And we had this before with Delphi or, I don't know, I can't even remember stuff from university, something for Windows, which looked awful. And in that, we had this. Probably everyone knows this picture. It's from BAM documentation. So BAM was trying to do this componentized approach for all the websites at Yandex. And on that, components also has been used by frameworks like Bootstrap. So if you're familiar with Bootstrap, and yeah, my clickers doesn't want to switch. You kind of know that Bootstrap has lots of components. And because components can be used pretty much everywhere, some of them, like iOS UI Design Kit, is even integrated in the popular design tools, which is cool. It's completely hung, but I can switch. Cool. So by combining same components into different sets, we can create a design patterns. And a design pattern is a reusable form of a solution for a design to a design problem. And the idea comes from this book by a gentleman and architect Christopher Alexander, written in the 70s, I guess. And he was created with pattern language concept for building cities and buildings. But it was actually very well adopted in software design as well. So you might be familiar with this. And in UI design, we have this idea as well. And we have this website, like there are many of them, but one of them called UI patterns, I guess, that collects different UI patterns for different design problems. Here, for example, is a password field for that encourages people entering more safe passwords. During my work for different clients, we have this very specific to the application patterns that basically combined from different components because this pattern was reused on different pages or parts of the application. So to me, components and patterns is a great way to communicate the ideas between designers and developers, and not only them. And they solve particular design problems. And great thing about components is that they are reusable. And yet, in the end of the day, designers need to go back to their design tools that operates on primitives like lines, rectangles, and developers have to work with code because it needs to be executed in the web browser. So oftentimes, I witnessed dialogues like when designers were, can this heading be smaller, please, a little bit? And the first developer was like, yeah, sure thing. We'll just make it a little bit smaller. And a week later, same designer or a different designer would be like, hey, can that heading be a little bit smaller, please, too? And another person would make them smaller again. And that's kind of a problem, because this leads to inconsistencies in a user interface. So that is an example of different font size and font styles in one single project, or back to this US government website where you have access to these CSS properties. You can basically do everything you want because it's super powerful. And I think that designers and developers have been speaking different languages. So let me elaborate a little bit more on that. What do I mean by different languages? Web developers, we speak programming languages mainly. We speak HTML, and don't get me wrong, but I think that is not simple. None of these languages are simple or easy to learn. I'm doing this for almost 20 years now, and I still need to look up how to center element in CSS. I honestly can't remember. That is just a flexbox, and it's not even a specification. So it's not simple. For web designers, it's kind of also, they have these tools that work with pixels or vectors, but that's about it. And then they kind of assume, okay, we will create beautiful pictures, and developers will pick it up and kind of realize how it should be, bent to the different hundreds of or thousands of different screen sizes, different resolutions, how the interaction should work, what happens when mouse hover occurs, or when a person touches this UI element. And I think this is where the question comes from. It's like, should designers code? Like every developer probably, and the same goes the other way around. It's like, should developers design probably? And I think the proper way of doing this would be to have some kind of a common language that we could communicate our ideas and intents without learning this completely different profession probably. So I was thinking about, if design language looks like this and developers language looks like this, can we have something in between or somehow merge with things, and in a way they can still communicate similar things? And I think the key element here are primitives. And primitives are basically also components, but kind of the simplest components you can get. So let's take a simple example. There's a button. I know it might be a boring one, but it kind of helps to illustrate what I'm trying to say. And the button hand can have 3 different variances. So it's like a default, tertiary, and primary button. So before components, we would use HTML and CSS to describe the user interface. So, and the dialogue would be, a designer would come with these beautiful designs for buttons and say, I want you to implement default, tertiary, and primary button, please. And developer would have a choice. Because in HTML, for some reason, were at least 2 valid ways to do to create a button. And I also created a third one, which you shouldn't be using, but it will create exactly the same button. So there are 3 ways at least if you use HTML and CSS as an API to create to communicate the design. And I don't know, which one? Which one should I choose today? It's like, and this leads to lots of inconsistencies in the user interface, because when you have the choice, it's easy to make a wrong choice. So if you think about components, the same idea, I'm a React developer, but I think the same ideas can be applied to pretty much everything. Web components, Vue, Angular, all of them have the idea of components today. But for the explanation's sake, I will be using React code here, or it's pretty much, it's super similar to HTML. So same dialog, designer default, primary button, please. And for developer or a consumer of a UI library, it's a button. It's a button, tetrary, and button primary, which to me looks pretty much similar to what designer wants. And you might be wondering, where are HTML primitives like button, paragraph, headings? Why should we, why would we need such primitives? Because we have some. There are 2 reasons. Let me elaborate on the first one. First of all, button, there's a small b, and a button, there's a big B, at least in React, it doesn't mean the same. The first one represents an HTML element, and it mimics the API of an HTML element. So if you want to add a primary, nothing will happen, because HTML doesn't know. There is no concept of primary button in HTML. You can do disable buttons though, but that's about it. And the second button is a capital B button. It's an abstraction over a button, obviously. But as a consumer of this button, first of all, you get access to these new properties like primary that are design related or your project related. And secondly, that hides the first button or input type button, you never know, from you. So you don't have a kind of this choice. And so to recap on the differences, I made this funny table here, which is, so button in the first example would have a CSS as a semantic value. So class name would be used as a semantic as well, because you want to style the button, right? And HTML can be pretty much everything because reasons. And because it's CSS, you get this full control. And as I said before, full control isn't always the best thing if you work with teams and you don't control people, and no one controls people. And the refactoring part, which is kind of a maintenance part of this, is also should be considered here, because if you want to update all the buttons, it's a tedious work. And there's the capital B button, there's a component. You have the strict contracts. You can enforce it. There is no CSS and HTML is an interface, so don't get me wrong. The button will still use HTML and CSS somewhere, but it will be in the implementation detail of a button, so you won't be caring about this. And it allows you to do stuff like, I don't know, let's add some more accessibility, let's add some area tags. You add it in a single place, and it goes everywhere. It's a single place where you have to add it. So you should be caring about these things. And usually, at that point, people are like, okay, sounds fair, we should probably try it. But then I say, okay, what about P? And people are like, no. That's too much, Andrey. That is bullshit. That is too much. That is just go. But if you think about it, it's pretty much the same. It's pretty much the same to me. It's a heading. So why should I be caring about how heading is implemented? And one of the things that I mentioned in the beginning, it's a talk about design systems, after all. So design systems is a set of instructions. So if we have a set of instructions, why can't we just enforce these instructions? There's a contract. So in this case, it's the size of a heading, right? So if we want headings look consistent across the whole application, we would just say we have 6 sizes for headings. So there is no infinite number of numbers, but just some meaningful names or not so meaningful names. It's your choice as a UI library developer in this sense. You still can do semantics. Same goes with text. If you want your text to look the same across the whole app, why not enforcing this? Why not say I have text and I have secondary text, type text secondary, that looks exactly the same across the whole app? Why should I figure what gray color should I be using? And the second reason for why I'm advocating for this approach is there are not enough HTML primitives for all elements. So it kind of works with text. It kind of works with headings. It's starting to be a little bit weird with links because you have an attribute. Button becomes a little bit more messy, but then designer wants a dropdown. And it's like, wait a minute. What should I copy that, put it where? And it's starting to be complicated. And it's easy to mess this thing up because there are lots of breaking parts here. There are lots of moving parts. So let's compare like HTML and CSS as an interface versus React as an interface in this example. One is, so basically both this example produce exactly the same HTML and use exactly the same CSS. But one of these examples shows you, OK, that is dropdown that has 5 menu items. One of them is a divider and one item is active. You can see, you can read it like English read it. Here you have to, I don't know, you have to think about it. And if you're writing this by your hand, it's really like, I don't know what half of the attributes this thing is using, although I consider myself a professional. So where other professionals, much more professional than I am, as I am, doing accessibility things, and they know why you need these things, but I don't, because it's just too much. So to me, primitives is just a human-friendly API for the exact same things we would be doing manually, but they kind of encapsulate it in a single place. And they allow you to, to move faster, to remove all this mental overhead when you have to use a dropdown or something more complex. And for designers, I think were also interesting implications if you start building these primitives with your code, because suddenly you can use things like React Sketch app and put all your design tokens, all your variables, or SAS variables, you can put them into the sketch and use exactly the same colors, but coming from a different place. So it's like you design not coming from Sketch, but design coming from a JavaScript file or CSS file into Sketch and into your application. Or like this is an example of the AMP design system, which you might be familiar with. And it also has a Sketch plugin that renders exactly the same UI in your Sketch. So your designer on the team can work with exactly the same primitives, exactly the same colors, but in Sketch. And this is how it works for Airbnb, for example. So they created all the user interface using primitives, and because they use primitives, they now can export them into Sketch and render them everywhere. Because there are no p tag in Sketch, you have to guess how it looks like, or on React Native, so that is kind of the idea behind it. So you can build the whole design system in code and export it to your design tool, and you can share it across different people across your team. And here's also an example of how Mark does this, even using class variables, and so it doesn't. You are not restricted to use just CSS and JS, for example. You still can use the tool that's familiar to you. And it also allows Figma, one of my favorite editors. So I switched from Sketch to Figma because I think it's just much more convenient for me when I want to share my work. If you don't know what Figma is, check it out because it's amazing. And the team from me also built this kind of design lint project that links colors you use in Figma against your design system and says you, hey, the color is a little bit off, so you probably meant to use that color. So all of these design tools are possible if you start sharing the knowledge about your design system from a single source of truth. So yeah, for designers, there are also huge benefits because it's design tools friendly API and it can be previewed in different environments seamlessly. And most importantly, I think it's a shared language between designers and developers. It's the thing we could share, we could talk about, and everyone would understand what I mean. So going back to the Tower of Babel, I think that universal language is much more important as universal technology because it's much more easier to iterate on technology as on a language. Because when we have established language, it's really hard to move on and kind of say, hey, yeah, doesn't mean anything. Because the meaning is here, and it's much harder. Technology is replaceable. Today we use React, tomorrow we can use web components. And the code stays the same, and the meaning of words for dropdown and our components or more complex stuff still remains. So I think we mistakenly prioritized technology over the communication, or the way we communicate with each other. And I encourage you to kind of reconsider this and try this primitives approach in your project, and let me know what you think. And here at GitHub, Artyom and me, because we run this workshop that's called component-driven development, where we basically go deeper into details, how to do this and how to enforce design system and teams. We created this awesome list for resources I used to prepare this talk, to find this interesting text. So if you're interested in this kind of things, check it out or submit your links, we can add it. And that's it for me. Thank you.